start this. So hello everyone, we are so happy to see you connected with us. I'm so excited to have today Riz Khan with me, Principal of Assessment in Distance Learning. We are going to spend 1 hour to explore some very interesting idea, answer some interesting question, and to connect with each other. Remember, in the chat, all panelists and attendees, and then in the question and answer if you have any question. Riz, we're ready to hear you, so go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to Ali Azzedine, to Stefan from 4 Generations for Education. And if you've been following, I'm sure you have caught up and seen a lot of fantastic webinars hosted by 4 Generations for Education. So thank you very much to Ali and to Stefan for allowing us all to be part of this one global education community through 4 Generations for Education. So my name is Riz Khan. I'm from the United Kingdom. We are expecting a storm here today at any point. So if you hear thunder or lightning, you will understand what's happening. I've had various roles in schools, such as head of department, MYP coordinator, middle school head. I'm also at the moment an IB consultant, school visiting team leader, and workshop leader. In any spare time that I do have as well, I also broadcast on a radio station here in the UK. And at the moment, I'm the director of the International Leadership Academy. And I'm very, very happy to share some insights with you all on a topic which I know is causing a lot of stir and interest in the global educational community. So hopefully, after today's session, you will have some clarity, some next steps on the things that you want to keep, to grow, and to change when it comes to assessment principles in distance learning environments. So coming on to today's webinar, there are 2 overarching guiding questions that will lead our session together today. The first one is, in what ways can we reconceptualize assessments to support distance learning environments? And it's important to highlight that it's not always about reinventing the wheel. It's about re-looking at some of the forms and types of assessments that we have to try and tailor and modify them for the distance or online learning environment. The second guiding question is to make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to making sure that assessment remains integral to learning in distance learning environments. So these are 2 of the overarching guiding questions for today's webinar. There is also a reflection tool I have posted up, and I know it's available for you via the link sent in the invitation and in the reminder for today's webinar. Now, this is a reflection tool that we will revisit towards the end of the session, but I'm just giving you a heads up so that you are aware of what to look forward to during the end of today's webinar. So if you would like, it would be great for you to keep some notes or some records on anything that you'd like to keep, grow, or change as we travel through and as we go through today's webinar, just so you have some concrete steps on the things that you might want to modify in your written curriculum, in your planning, and so on. So I've given you an example of how this tool can be used. So for example, after today's webinar, you might want to keep the frequency, the amount of formative assessments that you have. Secondly, you might want to grow the technological tools and the platforms and the software that you are using to make formative assessments more simpler, for example. And the third heading on this column is about the change, the growth part as well. So as a result of today's webinar, hopefully there are some key takeaways for you to apply in your educational settings. One way that you might be able to use this third column is to change, for example, the number of summative assessments to ease pressure on students and on teachers as well. So as I mentioned, we will come back to this reflection tool towards the end of the session, but it will be beneficial if we do keep some notes somewhere on the things that you want to keep, grow, and change.
I shared this link as well via the chat, and I would like to ask from all the participants if they are able to access it to download it. So it's really a personal document for you, so you can use it personally and not to work on the Google document.
Absolutely. So that facility is there for you to download it, so you can refer to it during this webinar and beyond as well. I know that through the series of webinars hosted by 4 Generations for Education, there have been a lot of hosts, and Ali Izzadeen, you have revisited this concept as well, is that we need to Maslow before we bloom. And I think I want to just remind myself of that as well, and hopefully remind everybody in the global educational community that this is a time of a global pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty. And if we look at this from the student level, I think that is really the crux of it. I want to share a story about one of my lovely nieces who's 11 years old, who's not in school at the moment. And she is going to be going to school again. The schools in the UK have gradually started to reopen. One thing that struck me about the story that I'm going to share is the amount of fear that students have as a result of this pandemic. That fear in social gatherings. So, for example, my niece was going to the shop, and she would refuse to touch any items. She'd refuse to go next to any other human being. Whilst these are some of the impacts of this global pandemic, I think from the educational perspective and from the educational community, that does tell us something about how students are thinking, how they are feeling. So in order for students to be safe, to be valued, to be secure, we do need to take care of their physiological needs as well as their safety needs as well. Perhaps there are students who have experienced relatives or family or friends who have suffered as a result of this disease, COVID-19. So all of these factors are things that we as educators need to keep in mind as we are aware. So I just wanted to remind us all that we need to Maslow before we bloom. And coming at Bloom's taxonomy, we have seen this several times. This webinar is designed to cater for lots of different curricula. Obviously, I have expertise in the International Baccalaureate, but the messages in today's webinar can be adapted to any curricula or any school community that you have. Bloom's taxonomy is something that we all use to design our learning engagements, to design our assessments, and so on. One of the misconceptions about Bloom's taxonomy is that the lower down that you are, the easier it is. Well, if you look at any level of Bloom's taxonomy, you can add a level of complexity to even the lower areas as well. For example, the remember and the understand. But one thing I do want to emphasize is that as trained teachers, we want to be able to utilize our skills so that we are able to support students in the more complex levels of thinking. So what that means for us in distance learning environments is that we might be able to focus on the remember and understand and encourage students to follow perhaps blended models of learning and to develop those levels of thinking, the remember and understand at home, so that when you are facing students in your distance learning classes, you can focus on the more high levels, the more complex levels of Bloom's taxonomy, such as apply, analyze, evaluate, create, so that we're helping students to develop those more complex levels of thinking, even in virtual learning environments. So that's just something to keep in mind, to try and focus on the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy as much as possible, using blended models, getting students to read stuff before they come into your classrooms, for example. Before we get started on this chat, I just want to recalibrate and make sure that we're all on the same level or a consistent perception about the purpose of assessment before we do get started. So in a moment, Ali Izzadeen is going to help me host the chat. And we would like you to spend just a minute or two thinking about this question. And as you're thinking about it, try and select the top 3 purposes of assessment in distance learning environments. Over to you, Ali.
So for all the people who are joining us here, feel free to use the chat. And for all the people who are on Facebook, you can also text us on Facebook, keeping an eye on what's happening there. And let's check the answers. So we have to plan our further lessons to improve student learning, to feed forward, to give a feedback, to group and regroup our students, to inform teaching and check understanding, to scaffold the learning, assess the misconception, to assess the learning. And I'm going to take a final one to continue with the curriculum and evaluate our teaching. The chat is going very fast, and those are the main idea from what do we have from our participants online.
Okay, well, one thing that I do notice from the responses coming in so far is that the majority of you are using the word learning. And I think that is absolutely fantastic. It's great that we've all got that focus. Even in distance learning environments, we do want to continually focus on learning, since that's the business that we are all in. I just want to reiterate some of the purposes of assessment in distance learning. Some of these you have already mentioned, some maybe new to some context, but absolutely the purpose of any form of assessment, be it in a face-to-face or a distant learning environment, is to support, to enrich, or to accelerate learning. And obviously you'll have a better awareness of your students and to be able to provide that level of scaffolding, that support, or that enrichment to help them grow in their learning. I think the other part of this jigsaw as well is to understand the student's prior knowledge. And for us, this will become very important actually. The moment that the face-to-face schooling starts again, I think it will be very wise, very valuable for schools to use very strong, high-quality diagnostic tools to figure out what the student starting points are, so that you're able to provide a focused level of learning to close their gaps in any areas that they might need some support. So I think support, enrich, or accelerate learning. The second most important one from my perspective is to understand prior knowledge, so that you're able to build on learning there. And some of these things you have mentioned, to inform curriculum, to inform your instruction, to make adjustments and changes, to go back, to reteach a concept, to enrich a concept. And I think for us, the other part of this is, while we're all engaged in this distance learning environment in some way, shape or form, is to also be able to use assessments to evaluate our provision as schools and to see how are we doing with distance learning. Because let's face it, we want learning to be at the center of any learning environment and provision. So that was just a little input from my end on the purpose of assessment. Here is something that I want to share with you. And as you are looking at this, it would be very valuable if you can look at some of these images, if you like, and to try and relate them to your own context, to your own educational system. What I've shown in front of you is a distance learning educational model. And in a moment, you will be engaging once again in a chat. And if you can just notice and have a look at the first things that you notice from this visual representation. So what do you see and what would you like to explore? So over to you now, Ali, to help me with this element of the webinar.
Sure. Riz, if you want to move to the following slide so we can see it bigger. Absolutely. And then I'm waiting for the answers. What do you see? And what are your questions? What would you like to explore? So we are seeing like student engagement and course design. I think of the purpose of assessment, student engagement, learning outcome, technology. And remember, this should provoke your thinking and push you to ask some questions. So what are those questions? All parts are connected with each other. How to align all those things. So I have how to support the learning, how we can ensure that the assessment is connected to the learning outcome, ICT and technology engagement. How do we do for each stage? Which one is the most important? What I want to know, what happens when technology does not engage the student? So we're seeing also the whole idea of integration and again, student engagement, the type of assessment during online learning. We had also a question, Riz, about asking for tools, and I answered it by typing that this is coming in the next few slides, and it's also in the bank of the resources that we shared with you. Rihanna is saying everything is connected, interconnected. Sarwat is asking us how we can increase the student engagement. Ali, hello Ali, he's asking us as well, what is the important aspect in terms of assessment? And I think we're ready to move to the following slides.
All right. Well, I have tried to keep a note and I've captured some of your observations and I will try and address some of them in this session, but I do apologize in advance if I'm not able to answer all of your questions because this is a huge area. And honestly, as we are all engaging with this distance learning environment, we are also learning as school leaders how to support our schools and how to support our teachers as well. So the other principle I want to share with you is that to utilize this as much as possible as a learning opportunity for your school and for your teachers, because unless you're an expert in digital course design, this is an uncharted territory for a lot of us. So I've taken some of your responses and notes of what you notice and what you would like to explore. And if I can just hit on some of those, absolutely, this can be used as a tool to design your distance learning courses or your distance learning engagement. It is a tool that will help you support learning, and it is a tool that will help you keep a focus on learning as well. I had made note of one question, which is, what is the most important aspect of assessment? And I think that's a very important question because I will come to that in a moment. So keep hold of that question and we will address that. But I just wanted to share some input from my perspective on what this model looks like and how it might be able to be used. The first thing I do want to highlight that it is a collaborative model. So I don't want you to feel that if you're a teacher working from home, that you're going to be able to master this, to accomplish this all on your own and individually and independently. If that's the case, then things will be very difficult when it comes to designing effective assessments in an online environment. This model does tap into the expertise of your school community. So, for example, if you've got tech coaches, if you've got a learning technology department, if you've got pedagogical leaders, they should be able to support you with some elements of this as well. Coming back to the question about what is the most important part to help learning, if I can just focus your attention to the first image that you see on the left is learning outcomes. Various curricula around the world, you might already have a set of very clear learning outcomes to share with students, to share with teachers so that they know exactly what needs to be taught. And those learning outcomes might come from your national curriculum, might come from your school developed curriculum, but a good starting point is to have a very clear set of learning outcomes so that you know exactly what you are going to be teaching and what students are going to be learning. Because without that set of learning outcomes, it's like driving a car on an open road without any form of navigation system. The learning outcome helps you as teachers to focus your attention on the learning engagement so that you're able to design your content around those learning outcomes. So I think one of my pieces of advice is to start with that, to figure out which learning outcomes that you're going to be focusing on for your first unit, for example, or your second or third unit, wherever you are in your sequence of learning. The other element of this is also to have an overview of your learning program. A lot of school curricula call these different things. What you really want to be looking at is your long-term planning. In IB schools, we call this curriculum overviews or your course outlines. In other curricula, we call this your long-term planning, so that you're able to see what are the different types of assessments that you have. Is there sufficient variety of assessment tools that you're using in your long-term planning as well? And that information will help you make some modifications if you find that you're assigning too many traditional tests, for example, to assess students with as well. The other element I want to highlight and share with you is something that I did notice in the chat, is that not everybody will have access to technology all of the time. Some families might be sharing technological resources, they might be sharing laptops, and that obviously will impact our course design, that will impact the way that we design our assessments too. So again, these are contextual factors that you will consider from your lens as teachers and school leaders, depending on where you are in the world. So consider technical limitation, student bandwidth as well. If you're asking students to use and to record a lot of videos, for example, then this might be a factor that is impacted because of the lack of bandwidth, because students might not have access to the internet or consistent connection with the internet too. There are also the element of mixed approaches where you're able to combine different platforms and different tools. I've seen a lot of schools engaging with platforms such as Google Classroom, OneNote. These are great tools. The more simple you can keep your tools, the better it will be for student engagement, the better it will be for you, so that you are able to design your learning engagements with clarity. The moment that we add layers of complexity to learning technology, it can be a barrier. And it can be a barrier from the teacher's perspective, because we are still learning to use tools that we're not so much familiar with because of this pandemic. But also, if you think about it from the student lens as well, there's a lot of science and a lot of research that is telling us that when we are learning through distance learning, we require greater levels of cognitive capacity. So we are using, in simple terms, much more brain power when we are learning online than when we are learning face-to-face. Now, if we digest that for a moment, if you think about your current design of your lessons, your current course design in your distance learning environments, to what extent is your learning engagement complex? To what extent is it simple? These are questions that you can ask yourselves rhetorically when you have a look at your courses. So the first stage of this is the storyboard element. So this is where you are mapping out the learning journey, if you like, with a set of learning outcomes, with an understanding of the what you are going to teach through your content, and with some flavor of the assessment tool or tools that you're going to use, because that will then impact your course design and the different technological tools that you're going to use. So if you think of it in 3 phases, the first phase is to map out the story of what you're going to be teaching, what students are going to be learning, how they're going to be assessed. The second phase is to look at those elements and merge it with the resources that you have available in your school context, in your communities, and also considering the resources that students may or may not have as well. And I think the third and last portion of this is that we want to obviously be able to evaluate our provision as schools to understand which are our areas of strength, what are we doing well in terms of online learning, and what are the areas in which we can grow. Obviously, that level of reflection will help you develop and to improve your written curriculum and, of course, your taught curriculum as well. Now, moving on to formative and summative assessment, these are two big areas in this topic. So I've tried to narrow it down as much as possible for you. Obviously, formative assessment is there to help us make improvements to learning, to make adjustments to curriculum. But what I want to emphasize is that through designing your formative assessments by looking at your learning outcomes, for example, to select the right tool for the right job, basically. So if you are assessing formatively process or content, there are different tools that will help you do that. I do have a list of tools that I will share with you towards the end of this session, and it's in the resource section on the Google Doc as well for you to take away. But to really look carefully at the tool that you want to use. Are you assessing process or are you assessing content? The second element to consider with formative assessment is to build in formative assessment checkpoints over time, if you like. And those checkpoints will help you collect data over time so that you are able to reteach, to enrich, or to revisit content, to revisit skills or understandings if you're figuring out that students haven't quite grasped a content. So mapping those out over time, those formative assessment checkpoints will help you also to focus on learning too. The third element here is that we all understand the power and the impact of feedback in learning generally. But there's also great value in peer and self-assessment in distance learning environments too. So these are things that we're already doing that we can continue doing in a distance learning environment, but also to widen our ways and to broaden the tools that we use to offer feedback. So for example, continuing with written feedback, that can be at a group level. So you might provide general feedback to a cohort of students, to a subgroup of students. There are other tools that you can use to record oral feedback. And there's a lot of research that is telling us students prefer oral feedback to written feedback as well. So these are all great practices that you can be making the most of during this pandemic. The other types of feedback is obviously to think about recording feedback, video feedback, and to provide feedback in smaller sub or breakout groups as well. The fourth and the final element about formative assessment is obviously to try and make it as valuable, as useful as possible so that you as the teacher and the student is able to see where their strengths are and where their areas of growth are too. The second aspect is summative assessment. And summative assessment, I think we have to be very strategic about summative assessment. We have to figure out, and this is the decision you might not be able to make individually as a teacher. You might be able to do this as a faculty or as a department or as a continuum or a school together. But what I want to highlight is that you can't assess everything. So stop adding that level of pressure on yourselves as teachers to think that you have to assess absolutely everything, because that is going to be counterproductive to learning in this environment. We have to understand what students need to know versus what is nice to know. So again, digest that for a moment, go back to your written curriculum after this webinar and ask yourself rhetorically, do students need to know this, or is this nice to know? Because you will understand from experience of delivering lessons in an online environment that the pace of learning is somewhat different. It might take you much longer to cover content, to cover a unit in a distance learning environment than it will for a face-to-face. So this is why this wisdom is there to figure out what students need to know versus what is nice to know. The second principle that I'd like to share with you for summative assessments is if you're not already looking at diversifying your assessment tools, but then to use this as an opportunity to look at tools that are available that move away from traditional forms of assessment, such as the standardized or the traditional written test. There are many models of authentic assessment. I think there's a researcher called Jonathan Wiggins who has a lot of published work on authentic assessment. So things like performance-based tasks might be a good tool to use for summative assessments, because you are lessening the risk of students sharing their answers with one another during this scenario. Because in a performance-based task, if it's done right, then students will apply their knowledge, their skills, or understandings to familiar and unfamiliar environments and situations too. The third recipe, if you like, for summative assessments is if you've got units where you have got large summative tasks, keeping in mind the pace of learning, keeping in mind the dynamics of online learning as well. You might not see your students as frequently as you would normally do in a face-to-face environment. It might be valuable to chunk some of those bigger summative tasks so that we're easing pressure on students, and we're also keeping in mind their wellness too. So chunking some of those larger summative tasks into more manageable pieces might help to focus on learning, whilst also keeping in mind students' wellness and their well-being too. Fourth and finally, for summative assessments, is to really think about the scenario, think about the environment, and to leverage that environment so that you can perhaps build in opportunities for students to provide some oral defense of what they are learning. What I mean by that is, for example, you might ask students to justify their choices for a presentation through an audio recording. That justification process is activating more high levels of thinking. They are thinking metacognitively when students are justifying the choices that they have made. So building in those types of conversations, the oral defense types of conversations, also helps to keep the focus on learning and to accelerate learning as well. Larry Ainsworth provides some really fantastic reading on curriculum design and his notion of power standards. If you think back to my earlier message about what do students need to know versus what is nice to know, Larry Ainsworth will help you look at that in greater detail and depth through his power standard. So I have added this name and this title to the resource section if anybody would like to revisit that in greater detail as well. But here are some assessment tools, and I'm not going to go through them one by one. You don't need to make a note of them as well, because we have provided you these assessment tools on the Google Doc shared as part of this webinar as well. But just coming back to my message about figuring out which tool is the right tool for the right job. So if you're looking at process, or if you're looking at assessing content, making sure that you look at the descriptions of the different tools that you're using to ensure that they align with the intention of your formative assessment. And something I just want to emphasize, or to wrap up my input on this webinar, is to remind ourselves of the order of operations in this distance learning environment. Is student relationships and well-being is absolutely pivotal, so that we are able to provide a learning environment where students feel safe, they feel fear-free, and that might mean that you will have to address some of the misconceptions or some of the fears with regards to COVID-19, so that students are able to feel safe in their school environment, so that they are able to perform well in assessments, be it formative or summative assessments. Coming back to that tool that I mentioned at the start of this webinar. So As a result of this input, if you like, and as a result of some of your interactions on the chat, please do take this opportunity now to save, to capture our learning together during this webinar and to record some of your thoughts on this reflection tool. So I'll hand it over now to Ali Ezzedine, who's going to help me navigate this part.
Very good. So I'm going to share again the link via the chat. Please remember, everyone, download this link on your computer. It has the reflection tool, it has the resources that Riz mentioned, and it has as well the bank of tools and applications that you can use. We are going to spend 2 minutes here. What do you want to keep? What do you want to grow? What do you want to change? Feel free to send this chat and those reflections as well in the chat so we can share them aloud. Riz, during your presentation, the chat was very interesting. People were sharing links, were sharing resources, were sharing ideas, and I have for you some questions. So I'm going to wait for the reflections, so we give them a kind of a silent moment to reflect and to share the reflection, and then I go to the question part where we are going to share our experiences and then wrap up this webinar. So let's reflect. What do you want to keep? What do you want to grow? And what do you want to change? And again, if you have any question, feel free to send it in the question and answer section. We are going to answer those questions in a few seconds. Yeah, it would be nice if you are sending us full sentences. So keep using varied tool of assessment, keep student relationships and wellness. So those are some of the reflection in the keep student well-being, grow definitely the tools we are using. Keep the grasps, the performance tasks, keep Maslow before Bloom, use different technological tools. Remember, Fathi, if you put all panelists and attendees so everyone can read all your answers. Use different technological tools. People are asking about an art workshop. I'm going to tell you about all those, what's coming next in few slides or in few minutes. Riham is telling us grow authentic assessment, grow the technological tool, keep the well-being as a priority, and ensure looking at the right tools for the right task. Okay, very interesting reflection. So Riz, if you can go back, yes, okay. So I can see your full screen now. I'm going to start asking you the question, right?
Let's do that.
Okay, so let's start with the question of Siham. Siham is telling us, during this time, I choose to assess my student through the formative assessment, and I'm not giving summative assessment. What do you think?
I think, Siham, thank you, first of all, for that question. I think it's a great question because I understand where you're coming from. And there's lots of different reasons as to why schools might not choose to add that layer of summative assessment pressure. I think the best advice I can share with you is that this has to be a school-based decision, and you have to consult the student and the parents community too, so that you are making the right choice for the students too. One thing that I would like to mention on that point is that I don't know, Siham, which part of the world that you are in, but if I give you an example, some schools are reopening up in some parts of the world, and those students have not experienced school for a number of weeks, for a number of months. Those students have missed out on opportunities for learning. However, they will also be progressing to the next phase of learning, be it the following year. For example, a student currently in year 10 will inevitably moving up to year or grade 11 or 12 in the future. So we have to be very smart to figure out what do we need to teach here and now so that students are well prepared with the fundamental knowledge and skills that they need to know for the next chapter in their learning. So hopefully that will add something else to help you think about this decision when you do make it. So Sihan, thank you for that question.
And the people who attended my webinar, What to Teach During a Crisis in Arabic or in English, I just said between parentheses, let's be revolutionary during this time, stop those summative assessment and work more on evidencing learning, collecting student piece of work, and then make sure that those pieces are authentic, relevant, and meaningful. So this is from my side. I want to push the idea to the extreme. If to move to the following question, we have two people who asked the same question, and they are asking how we can make sure that the students are doing the task and not the parents.
So again, this is a very, very good question. And the bottom line is that you can't, as teacher, monitor what happens at home. But what you can do is design summative assessment tasks that allow students to demonstrate their learning in familiar and allow students to transfer their learning to unfamiliar situations. So my advice here is to look and to do some reading and research on authentic assessment and performance-based assessment tasks. That will help alleviate some of those challenges.
Okay, so let me move to the, again, I want to connect to this idea. And on Monday, we had the same question because we had the assessment workshop or the assessment webinar for early years. And I really highlighted this whole idea of making one-to-one meetings, asking for tasks that the student they need to do, they need to video themselves. And then here you are sure that this is from them. For sure, if you are sharing with them a standardized test, a multiple choice test, or those traditional way of assessing, someone else can do it for them. And let's remember that building an environment of trust, respect, sharing some essential agreement with the parents and the student, this will help a lot in having real things.
There are also other tools that will support you. So for example, if you want to assign mini group projects during this time, or if students are engaging in large projects such as presentations and so on, you might encourage students to keep a journal, to keep a log of exactly what they are doing so that you're able to track their journey towards the end product as well. And there's lots of different tools. It doesn't have to be something very complex or very smart. You can be using a simple Word document where you encourage students to write down the contributions that they have made in a group or a paired task, for example.
It is for all our participants who are asking about the early years. I would like to remind them that we have on our YouTube channel a webinar where we discussed everything related to early years. So I'm going to share with you the link in a few minutes in the chat. I'm going to move to another question, and then Khitam is asking, some students, they have never been engaged or rarely participated in the online learning. How we can assess them? We have to write the reports. So I will hear from Riz, his feedback, and I'm sure you also know Khitam. We worked together with her previously. So how to assess those students that they have not showed up on the online lessons?
Okay. Well, Khitam, I think there are a couple of layers to this. The first layer is to figure out why is a student not engaging? It could be because they don't feel safe. They don't want to be in camera. They don't want to share their views in an online scenario. Or it could be that they don't have the resources, the confidence, or the tools. So please do keep an open mind about why students don't want to engage. It's very important that we don't make assumptions about students because we don't know what is happening at home and some of the social factors that impact the learning too. I think the second part of it is also to keep the feedback loop ongoing with parents and to engage the other people that you might have in your school communities. For example, if you have tutors or mentors for these students, a homeroom teacher, a head of year, is to make sure that they are aware of what is happening so that they can do some digging as well, so that they can do some follow-up actions, perhaps contact the student, to contact their home, firstly to make sure is their welfare and their well-being okay, and secondly to figure out ways to support them. And secondly, I think that these are school-based decisions as well. So as a school, you need to be thinking about what is our view on students who don't engage, what should be the next step. So these are conversations that you could be having at the school level to make sure that your actions are consistent. So one teacher, for example, a student doesn't engage with one teacher, there is a letter sent home, the student doesn't engage with the second teacher, nothing happens. So again, it's very important that you keep this message consistent as a school community.
I would like also to share again, something happened with my daughter. She's 4.5 years, so she's an early year educator. And then during all those weeks, we are now on week 13 with the online learning in Dubai. She's attending 3 Zoom meetings online. And then they are very small groups, so only 5 students are joining the Zoom meeting, interacting with the teacher, doing some fun activities, using the whiteboard, doing some spelling, doing some oral discussions. And then recently, we had a one-to-one meeting. So the teacher called us, asked for a time where she spent a half an hour with my daughter, maybe revising some learning outcomes. And then at the end of the session, I was invited to listen to what are the next steps and how to do it. And I think this is an ideal approach for all the ages. If they are not joining, if they are not listening, if they are maybe not interested in the group work, create a moment for them on a different time, maybe in the afternoon, check with their parent. So you are really making sure why they are not here, why they are not interacting.
To follow up on what you were mentioning there, Ali, is especially teenagers and middle school students, they love the element of choice. The moment you give them choice, they feel empowered. So if you're able to provide menus of the different types of learning engagements that students can pick and select from, then that will also help with empowerment and engagement as well.
I have we have a lot of questions, so it's hard to pick which question to answer. Farah is asking about involving the parents. And here again, I'm so interested to know how many schools they had a Zoom meeting or Microsoft Teams meetings or Google meeting for the parents at the beginning of this lockdown, explaining really for the parents how they can do it, what do they need to do, what is the role. So what is your perspective also, Riz, on the education for parents and involving the parents?
I think the partnership with parents in a distance learning environment should certainly not change. Parents are always partners in the learning journey. The more communication you can share with parents about what students are learning, how they're going to be assessed, I think the more at ease they will feel. And I think the other layer to this is the parent perspective. Parents are not expert educators. So we have to keep in mind that parents are lay people in the fact that we use words in education like summative and formative, and parents might not be familiar with those. So to make sure our communication is plain, is simple and easy to understand. Secondly, as you mentioned, is to continue with the engagement with parents through presentations, through newsletters, through regular updates. And I think the other part of this is to look at this at a macro level from the leadership angle, is to figure out how are we still maintaining that sense of community in our school. Because community and a sense of belonging, as we already know, are very important for all students of any age. And in this distance learning environment, the student has been removed from their circle of friends. They have been removed from their comfort zone. They have been removed from an environment where they perhaps feel safe and valued, and perhaps are in an environment at home where they don't feel safe, valued, and secure. So it's important that we, as school leaders, as teachers, think about ways to maintain that community. So, for example, are we still continuing with our weekly assemblies? Are we still continuing with our parent-teacher meetings, which can be conducted virtually and remotely too? So there's lots of different ways that we can engage parents as partners. And I think the other part of that is to highlight the sense of community that educators, school leaders, and teachers need to be fully aware of, because that sense of belonging and community can also impact the students' experience in learning and assessment too.
We got very interesting idea in the chat also how to engage parents. I hope we answered your question, Farah. Is people talked about WhatsApp group, daily plan, weekly plan, help desk. So a lot of interesting idea. And remember, we are in an unusual moment. So with this unusual moment, you need to be very creative. Maybe you don't need to send the traditional report card at the end of this academic year. That's why we asked at the beginning, have you changed your assessment structure, policies, and procedures?
Coming back to the report card, the first element of designing distance learning is to come up with that storyboard, right? And part of that is to decide your learning outcomes. What do students need to know versus what is nice to know? So once you have that mapped out, that will then also determine your report card, right? So again, all of these do impact, these different pieces of the jigsaw impact one another.
It is a final question from my side, even though we have a very full list. So how do we assess practical examination in science, like experiments, maybe all those disciplines where we need to move, we need to go to the lab, we need to go to the design room? So
I think we have to be very wise to figure out what resources, first of all, are available to us. Students at home might not have the Bunsen burners, the pipettes, and so on. So again, map those learning outcomes so that you keep in mind the limited or the available resources to you. There are lots of creative ways that you can use stickers. I've seen an example of a science lesson that was about the parts of the human body, and the students themselves, they came up with their own ways of labeling parts of the human body. So think about ways of using the student as your main resource. They might be able to say, if we want to do an experiment on, I don't know, on saturation, is that even a thing? On saturation, they might be able to come up with an experiment to do in a safe way at home. So I think the main consideration is about resources there. And the second layer of that is to consider your learning outcomes, keeping in mind the resources that are available. And it might be the case that you have to put a hold on some of those more practical experiments because it might not be safe to do it as well without adult or without teacher supervision.
Yes, so many people also shared some online science lab website links. So Riz, we can start wrapping up our session, a very interactive session. And then,
well, I think that's all we have time for today. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure working with 4 Generations to deliver this webinar. It's been very useful for me. I've taken away a lot from your chat, from your questions as well. So thank you for engaging. But if you do want to remain in touch, you can contact us at the International Leadership Academy. The details are there on screen for you now. But once again, hats off, salute to all the educators around the world who are doing their part to deliver high quality learning for our students in the global arena. So once again, thank you very much. And I hope you all continue to stay safe.
Okay, following slide and then final message in my chat. I'm going to share with you what's next. We still have a few webinars, so feel free to join us. And thank you again very much for this.
Thank you very much.